I never imagined I would measure my life in years without my child. Before it happened, time felt predictable. Days moved forward, seasons changed, and I believed that no matter what happened between a parent and a child, there was always a return. A phone call, a visit, a moment when things would make sense again. I was wrong. When my son left, it did not happen in a dramatic way. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no final argument that felt like an ending. It happened quietly, which made it harder to understand and even harder to accept. One day, he was part of my everyday life, and then slowly he wasn't. At first, I told myself it was temporary. He needed space. He was growing. He was finding his own way in the world. Every parent tells themselves these things because believing them hurts less than admitting the truth. The truth was that I was losing him, and I did not know how to stop it. The calls became shorter, the messages came less often, then one day they stopped entirely. I replayed every conversation in my head, searching for a moment I could point to and say, "That's when it broke," but there wasn't one. There was no single mistake I could fix, no apology that would suddenly bring him back. There was only silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, the kind that sits with you at night when the house is too quiet, the kind that makes you check your phone even when you know there will be nothing there. I remember the first holiday without him. I set a place at the table without thinking, then realized what I had done. That chair stayed empty the entire night. No one said anything about it, but everyone felt it. Grief like that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. I told myself to be strong. Parents are supposed to be strong. We are supposed to let go when our children grow. We are supposed to trust that they will come back when they are ready, but this was different. This wasn't distance, this was absence. I felt it in the smallest moments. When I passed his favorite cereal in the grocery store, when I heard a song he used to play on repeat, when I saw someone his age laughing with their parents in public and felt something tighten in my chest. I questioned myself constantly. Did I push too hard? Did I not listen enough? Did I fail him in ways I didn't see at the time? There is a unique kind of pain that comes from losing a child who is still alive. You can't mourn openly because people don't understand. They say things like, "He'll come around," or "Give him time," or "Kids go through phases." What they don't see is the quiet devastation. The way you wake up every morning hoping today will be the day your phone rings. The way you rehearse what you would say if it did. The way you blame yourself in the absence of answers. Years pass this way. Not all at once, but slowly, painfully. 1 year turned into 2, 2 into 3. Each year marked by the same unanswered questions. I learned how to function while carrying the weight of his absence. I went to work. I paid bills. I smiled when I needed to. From the outside, my life looked normal. Inside, it felt like something essential had been taken from me. There were moments when anger crept in, anger at him for leaving, anger at myself for not knowing how to fix it, anger at a world that kept moving forward when my heart felt stuck in the past. But anger never lasted long. It always collapsed into sadness. I missed him in ways that words can't fully explain. Not just who he was, but who he was becoming. I missed the future conversations we never had. The moments I would never get to witness, and the hardest part was not knowing if he missed me at all. 5 years is a long time to live with unanswered questions. It changes you. It strips away illusions you didn't know you had. It forces you to sit with pain you cannot solve. I learned quickly that love does not guarantee closeness, that being a parent does not mean you will always be allowed access to your child's life, that sometimes the people we love most walk away without explaining why. And in that realization, something inside me began to shift. At first, I resisted it. I did not want to accept a reality where my son and I were strangers. I held onto hope tightly, believing that letting go would mean giving up on him. But over time, I learned the difference between hope and denial. Hope allows space for healing. Denial keeps you trapped in the past. I began to understand that my role as a parent was changing in ways I never expected. I could no longer guide, protect, or fix. All I could do was love him from a distance and learn how to survive the silence. This was not the lesson I wanted to learn, but it was the one life was teaching me. I didn't know then that these 5 years would reshape how I understood love, loss, forgiveness, and myself. I didn't know that the pain would eventually give way to insight. All I knew in that first chapter was this: I had lost my son, and I had no map for finding my way back to myself. After my son disappeared from my life, guilt became my constant companion. It was there when I woke up in the morning. It followed me through the day, and it sat beside me at night when the house grew quiet. At first, I did not recognize it as guilt. I thought it was responsibility. Parents are conditioned to believe that everything about their child's life somehow traces back to them. When things go well, we downplay our role. When things fall apart, we take the full weight of it. I replayed his childhood in my mind as if it were evidence in a trial. Every decision, every rule I enforced, every moment I lost my patience, every time I was tired and distracted when he needed my attention. I wondered which moment planted the seed of distance, which word lingered longer than I intended, which silence spoke louder than my love. The mind is cruel when it is searching for answers it cannot find. It will invent them if it has to. I blamed myself for things I could not control, for choices he made as an adult, for emotions he never expressed, for wounds he may have carried silently. I told myself that if I had been more understanding, he would have stayed. If I had been less strict, he would have trusted me more. If I had listened better, he would have felt safer. These thoughts did not arrive all at once. They crept in quietly, disguising themselves as reflection. But reflection turned into punishment. There is a particular kind of guilt that parents experience when a child leaves without explanation. It is not loud or dramatic. It is persistent. It whispers instead of shouts. It tells you that you failed at the one job that mattered most. I tried talking about it with people, but the words never came out right. How do you explain that your child is alive, but gone, that there is no funeral, no closure, no shared language for this kind of grief? People responded with optimism. They said things like, "He'll come back. He just needs time. You did your best." They meant well, but their reassurance felt hollow, because guilt does not respond to logic. It responds to emotion, and emotionally, I felt responsible. I looked at old photos and searched for signs. Was he smiling because he was happy, or because he felt he had to be? Did he feel supported or controlled? Did he feel loved or judged? Memory became unreliable. Moments I once remembered fondly now felt suspect. I questioned everything. I also began questioning myself outside of my role as a parent. My confidence eroded. I second-guessed my instincts. I wondered if the people in my life stayed because they wanted to, or because they had not yet found a reason to leave. Losing my son did not just affect our relationship. It altered how I saw myself in every relationship. I became quieter, more careful, afraid of saying the wrong thing. I did not want to be the kind of person someone needed to escape from. There were nights when I lay awake imagining conversations that never happened. Conversations where he finally told me why he left. Conversations where I apologized for things I did not know I had done. Conversations where everything made sense again. I rehearsed these conversations so often that they felt real. And then I would wake up and remember that they existed only in my head. That realization hurt every time. The guilt intensified during milestones, birthdays, holidays, moments when parents are expected to be present. Each passing year felt like confirmation of my failure. If I had done things right, surely he would have returned by now. I compared myself to other parents, parents whose children called regularly, parents who complained about minor disagreements, unaware of how fortunate they were. I smiled and nodded while inside I felt like an imposter, a parent without a child. I wondered if I had earned this absence, if this was the consequence of mistakes I could not undo. The guilt also carried fear. Fear that I would never get another chance, fear that time would erase me from his memory, fear that even if he returned, too much damage had already been done. I realized how little space there is in society for parents like me. There is support for grief after death. There is language for estrangement caused by abuse, but there is very little acknowledgement for parents who are left behind without explanation, so I carried it alone. I began to isolate myself emotionally, not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer. If I kept my world small, there was less room for reminders of what I had lost. But isolation has a way of magnifying guilt. Without outside perspective, the mind turns inward and becomes its own judge. I told myself stories about who I was, that I was too much, that I had asked for too much, that my expectations had pushed him away. It took me a long time to realize that guilt thrives in the absence of compassion. I had compassion for everyone else, for my son, for his struggles, for his choices, but I had none for myself. I held myself to an impossible standard. I expected perfection in hindsight. I judged past decisions with knowledge I did not have at the time. I forgot that parenting is not a controlled environment. It is a relationship between two imperfect humans, each carrying their own wounds. Slowly, painfully, I began to question the guilt itself, not to dismiss it, but to understand it. I asked myself why I was so quick to blame myself and so hesitant to acknowledge his autonomy, why I believed love should guarantee closeness, why I believed responsibility meant control. These questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. I began to see that guilt had become a way to stay connected to him. As long as I blamed myself, he remained central to my identity. Letting go of guilt felt like letting go of him. That realization changed everything. I understood that my guilt was not just about regret. It was about fear. Fear of accepting a reality where I could love deeply and still be left. That truth was harder to face than self-blame, because if it wasn't all my fault, then it meant some things were simply beyond my control, and that is terrifying. Learning to loosen my grip on guilt did not happen overnight. It came in small moments, moments when I allowed myself to remember without accusation, moments when I acknowledged that I did the best I could with what I knew then. I started speaking to myself the way I would speak to another parent in my situation. With gentleness, with understanding, with honesty, I reminded myself that love does not always look the same to everyone, that intentions can be good even when outcomes are painful, that mistakes do not erase devotion. The guilt did not disappear, but it softened. It became less of a verdict and more of a signal of how deeply I cared, of how much I loved, and that love, I realized, was not something to punish myself for. By the end of those years, I had not resolved the guilt completely, but I had learned something important. I could hold accountability without self-destruction. I could reflect without condemning myself. I could grieve without assigning blame, and in that shift, a small space opened up, a space where healing could eventually begin. I still missed my son every day. I still wished for answers, but I was no longer defined solely by what I believed I had done wrong. I was beginning to understand that losing him did not mean losing myself, and that realization prepared me for the next phase of this journey, one that would force me to confront not just guilt, but identity. When my son left my life, I didn't just lose contact with him. I lost a version of myself I had inhabited for decades. I had always known who I was in relation to him. I was his parent, his protector, the one who worried, the one who waited up at night, the one who noticed the smallest changes in his voice. That role shaped my days, my decisions, my sense of purpose. And then suddenly it was gone. No one warns you what happens to your identity when a child disappears from your life but remains alive somewhere else. There is no ceremony to mark the end of that role, no acknowledgement that something fundamental has shifted. You just wake up one day and realize you no longer know where you belong. I struggled to answer simple questions. How's your son doing? What does your family look like? What are you proud of? Each question felt like a test I didn't know how to pass. I learned how to respond vaguely. He's doing his own thing. He's grown now. He's busy. I said these things not to deceive others, but to protect myself, because telling the truth meant admitting something I wasn't ready to face. That I didn't know my place anymore. Parenthood doesn't end when a child leaves, but when the connection is severed without explanation, the role becomes confusing. You're still a parent, but you're no longer needed. Still loving, but no longer included. That contradiction creates a quiet crisis. I felt untethered, as if a part of my life had been erased, but the outline remained. I noticed the emptiness in unexpected ways. When I planned my weekends and realized there was no one to consider but myself, when I made decisions without asking for his opinion, when I stopped thinking in terms of we and started thinking only in terms of I, at first, I thought this freedom would feel relieving. But it didn't. It felt hollow. I didn't know how to exist outside of that role. I had spent so many years orienting my life around someone else that when he was gone, I felt directionless. Loneliness settled in quietly. Not the kind that comes from being alone in a room, but the kind that comes from feeling unseen in your most important identity. I could be surrounded by people and still feel completely isolated. There were moments when I caught myself wanting to share something with him. A story, a memory, a thought, and then I would remember there was no place to send it. Those moments hurt more than the silence itself. I also began questioning my worth outside of parenthood. If I was no longer needed in that role, what was I for? What value did I bring to the world? These questions felt selfish, even shameful. Parents are taught to be selfless, to give without expectation. But when giving becomes invisible, it leaves a mark. I started to feel like I had been erased from his life story. Like a chapter he closed without explanation, and in that erasure, I began erasing myself. I stopped pursuing interests I once enjoyed. I avoided conversations that might drift toward family. I kept my life small to avoid confronting the loss. Time moved forward, but I felt stuck. I noticed that I had stopped making long-term plans, as if part of me believed that planning without him was pointless, as if my future was on hold, waiting for his return. That realization frightened me. I saw how deeply his absence had shaped my choices, how much of my energy was still tied to someone who wasn't present. I began to understand that identity loss is one of the most overlooked aspects of estrangement. People focus on the conflict, the silence, the pain, but they rarely talk about the quiet dismantling of self. I wasn't just grieving my son. I was grieving the person I was when I was his parent in practice, not just in name. There were days when I felt invisible, as if the most meaningful part of my life had happened already, and now I was simply existing. That thought terrified me. I realized that if I didn't confront this loss of identity, it would consume me. Not all at once, but slowly, so I started asking difficult questions. Who am I when no one needs me the way they used to? Who am I when my love has nowhere to land? Who am I beyond the roles I've played? These questions did not have immediate answers. They weren't meant to, but asking them marked the beginning of something important. I began experimenting with small acts of self-definition, not reinvention. Just gentle exploration. I returned to things I once enjoyed but had set aside, reading without distraction, walking without a destination, sitting with my thoughts without rushing to escape them. At first, these moments felt empty, but slowly they became grounding. I realized how much of my identity had been built around responsibility rather than desire, around obligation rather than curiosity. Without my son's presence, I was forced to confront parts of myself I had ignored, parts that didn't exist solely to support someone else. This was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. I started noticing a subtle shift in how I spoke about myself. I no longer defined my days by what I was missing. I began noticing what was still here, my resilience, my capacity for reflection, my ability to endure without hardening. These were not traits I had celebrated before, but they were shaping me now. Loneliness did not disappear, but it changed. It became less about absence and more about space. Space I didn't know how to fill yet. I began to see that identity is not static. It evolves, sometimes painfully. And while I never wanted to lose my role as an active parent, I was being asked to redefine what parenthood meant to me. It no longer meant guidance or daily presence. It meant holding love without control, care without access, hope without expectation. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. I stopped seeing myself as incomplete. I began seeing myself as transitioning. This was not an ending. It was a reshaping. I was still his parent, just not in the way I had imagined, and I was still a person with a life that mattered, even if it no longer looked the way I had planned. Accepting this did not erase the pain, but it gave it context. I understood that losing my son for those years forced me to confront a truth I had avoided. My identity could not depend entirely on someone else's presence. That lesson was difficult, but it was necessary, and it prepared me for the next realization, that loneliness, when faced honestly, has the power to teach us how to be whole again. Loneliness did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, quietly, until one day I realized it had become the background of my life. At first, I confused loneliness with missing my son. I told myself that once he returned, everything would feel full again, that this emptiness was temporary, something I simply had to endure. But as months turned into years, I began to understand that loneliness had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about his absence, it was about the silence that followed, the routines that changed, the conversations that no longer happened. Loneliness settled into the small spaces, mornings when there was no reason to rush, evenings when the day ended without anyone asking how it went, weekends that stretched out without structure or purpose. I learned that loneliness is not always about being alone. It is about feeling disconnected from the part of yourself that once felt useful. I went through my days performing normalcy. I showed up where I was expected to. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled when appropriate. But inside, I felt detached, as if I were observing my life from a distance rather than living it. I noticed how much of my energy had once gone into caring for someone else, making plans, solving problems, anticipating needs. Without that focus, my days felt strangely empty, not peaceful, empty. People around me assumed I was adjusting well. They saw independence, resilience, strength. What they did not see was the quiet effort it took just to get through the day without collapsing under the weight of missing someone I loved. Loneliness has a way of distorting time. Hours feel longer, nights feel heavier, memories surface without warning. I found myself avoiding certain places, restaurants where families gathered, stores during holidays, events where parents spoke casually about their children. It wasn't jealousy, it was grief. Grief for a connection that had been severed without explanation. I also realized how isolating this experience was socially. There was no script for it, no socially acceptable way to say, "My child is alive, but not part of my life," so I kept quiet. Silence became my shield, but silence also deepened the loneliness. I stopped reaching out because I didn't know what to say. I stopped sharing because I didn't want to burden anyone with a story that had no resolution. The world prefers narratives with closure. Mine had none. I learned to sit with discomfort in ways I never had before, to endure evenings without distraction, to let tears come and go without explanation. Loneliness stripped away my ability to escape myself, and in that stripping, something unexpected happened. I started listening to myself. I noticed how often I had ignored my own emotions in the past, how I had stayed busy to avoid feeling, how much of my identity had been wrapped around usefulness. Without my son's presence, I could no longer avoid the quiet. At first, that quiet terrified me. It magnified every fear I had about aging, purpose, and relevance. I wondered who I would become if this loneliness never ended, if this silence was permanent. Those thoughts were dark, but they were honest. Loneliness forced me to confront truths I had avoided, that love does not protect us from loss, that connection is fragile, that control is an illusion. I realized how much I had relied on my role as a parent to give my life meaning. Without it, I felt exposed. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when getting out of bed required effort, when the future felt shapeless and uncertain. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I realized that loneliness was teaching me something. It was teaching me how to be present without purpose, how to exist without validation, how to sit with pain without trying to fix it. These lessons were not comforting, but they were grounding. I began to understand that loneliness is not an enemy to be defeated. It is an experience to be understood. It shows you where you have attached your worth. It reveals where you have avoided yourself. Slowly, I stopped trying to fill the loneliness. I stopped distracting myself from it. I stopped treating it like something that needed to be solved. Instead, I allowed it to exist. This was not resignation. It was acceptance. I accepted that missing my son was part of my reality, that loving someone who is absent hurts, that this pain did not make me weak. Acceptance did not remove the loneliness, but it softened it. It became less sharp, less consuming. I began finding comfort in small, ordinary moments, morning light through the window, the rhythm of walking, the familiarity of my own breath. These moments did not replace what I lost, but they reminded me that life was still happening. I noticed how my relationship with myself began to change. I spoke to myself more gently. I judged myself less harshly. Loneliness taught me self-compassion in a way nothing else ever had. I also learned that loneliness does not mean you are unlovable. It means you are human. It means you have loved deeply. It means you have invested your heart fully, and that is not something to be ashamed of. As time passed, the loneliness transformed. It became quieter, more spacious. It no longer screamed at me. It sat beside me. I realized that I was learning how to live with absence without being defined by it. This did not mean I stopped missing my son. It meant I stopped disappearing alongside him. I began to re-engage with the world slowly. Cautiously, I allowed myself to be curious again, to wonder about my own future, to imagine a life that did not revolve entirely around loss. Loneliness did not vanish, but it loosened its grip, and in that space, something new began to form. Not hope in the traditional sense, but stability, the understanding that I could survive this, that I could feel deeply and still function, that I could love without access and still be whole. This realization did not bring joy, but it brought strength, and that strength prepared me for the next phase of this journey, a phase where loneliness would give way to reflection, and reflection would begin to reshape how I understood love, boundaries, and letting go. Acceptance did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrived slowly in fragments over time. For a long while, I believed acceptance meant giving up, that if I accepted my son's absence, I was somehow betraying my love for him. That acceptance meant closing a door I was not ready to close. But I learned that acceptance is not the same as approval. It does not mean agreeing with what happened. It does not mean forgetting the pain. It simply means acknowledging reality as it is, rather than as I wish it to be. This distinction took me a long time to understand. For years, I lived in resistance, resisting the silence, resisting the unanswered questions, resisting the idea that I had no control over when or if my son would return. That resistance drained me. I carried it everywhere, in my body, in my thoughts, in the way I moved through the world. I realized that much of my suffering was not just from the loss itself, but from my refusal to accept the limits of my power. I wanted answers I would never receive. I wanted explanations that no one was offering. I wanted reassurance that might never come. Acceptance began when I stopped demanding what could not be given. This did not happen overnight. It started with small internal shifts. I stopped replaying past conversations, searching for the moment I could have done something differently. I stopped trying to rewrite history in my mind. I began acknowledging that some relationships break not because of a single failure, but because of accumulated misunderstandings, emotional distance, and unspoken expectations. This realization was painful. It meant admitting that love alone does not guarantee connection, that good intentions do not prevent harm, that even when we do our best, we can still lose people we care deeply about. Acceptance also meant confronting my own mistakes, not to punish myself, but to understand. I examined the ways I may have unknowingly contributed to the distance, moments when I listened less than I spoke, times when I assumed instead of asking, ways I may have held expectations without realizing their weight. This reflection was uncomfortable, but it was honest. At the same time, I learned to separate responsibility from blame. I could acknowledge my imperfections without taking full responsibility for the outcome. Relationships are shaped by more than one person. Estrangement is rarely one-sided. Acceptance required balance. Holding accountability without self-destruction. Holding love without entitlement. Another part of acceptance involved redefining boundaries. For a long time, I believed boundaries were walls, that setting them meant pushing people away, that they were acts of selfishness. But through this experience, I learned that boundaries are acts of self-respect. I had spent years emotionally available to someone who was not present, waiting, hoping, holding space indefinitely. This constant openness kept me suspended in pain. Acceptance meant allowing myself to step back emotionally without abandoning love. It meant saying quietly to myself, I cannot continue to live in a state of waiting. This was one of the hardest realizations. Because waiting felt like loyalty, letting go felt like betrayal. But I learned that loyalty to someone else should not come at the expense of loyalty to yourself. I began practicing emotional boundaries. I limited how often I revisited old messages and photos. I stopped imagining future reunions as a way to survive the present. I allowed myself to live days without centering my thoughts on absence. These changes felt uncomfortable at first, almost wrong, but slowly they created space for my own thoughts, my own needs, my own growth. Acceptance also reshaped how I understood love. I realized that love does not require constant proximity. It does not require access. It does not require reciprocation to be real. Love can exist quietly, without action, without acknowledgement. This understanding allowed me to release the need for validation. I no longer needed proof that my love mattered. It mattered because it existed. That realization brought a strange sense of peace. Acceptance also changed how I related to grief. I stopped expecting grief to disappear. I stopped waiting for a day when I would no longer feel the loss. Instead, I learned to integrate grief into my life. It became something I carried, not something that carried me. There were still difficult days, holidays, birthdays, unexpected reminders, but those days no longer derailed me completely. I learned how to move through them without collapsing. Acceptance gave me emotional stability, not happiness. Not closure, stability. I also began to notice how much energy I had spent trying to appear strong for others. I stopped minimizing my experience. I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain without shame. This honesty deepened my relationship with myself. I trusted my own emotions more. I judged them less. Acceptance also brought clarity about what I could and could not control. I could not control my son's choices. I could not control his timeline. I could not control how he remembered the past, but I could control how I treated myself, how I spent my days, how I defined my worth. This shift was empowering. It reminded me that while I could not reclaim the past, I could shape the present. I also learned that acceptance does not mean closing the door forever. It means leaving the door unlocked without standing in the doorway. It means being open without being consumed. I stopped measuring my progress by external outcomes. I stopped asking whether I was healed. Instead, I noticed changes in how I responded to pain. I no longer panicked when sadness surfaced. I no longer felt threatened by quiet moments. I no longer defined myself solely by loss. Acceptance gave me room to breathe. It allowed me to imagine a future that was not dependent on reunion, but still allowed space for it. This balance felt fragile at first, but with time it strengthened. I realized that acceptance was not an endpoint. It was a practice, something I returned to daily. Some days acceptance came easily. Other days it required effort, but it grounded me. It reminded me that life continues even when answers do not arrive. That growth is possible even when relationships remain unresolved, and that love, when freed from expectation, can become lighter. This phase of acceptance did not erase the past, but it changed how the past lived inside me. It softened the sharp edges. It allowed me to carry the story without being crushed by it, and as acceptance took root, it prepared me for the next stage, a stage where I would begin to rebuild, not the life I had before, but a life that could coexist with loss without being defined by it. Rebuilding did not begin with motivation. It began with exhaustion. I reached a point where surviving was no longer enough, but I also didn't know how to live forward. I wasn't broken in an obvious way. I functioned, I showed up, I handled responsibilities, but inside my life felt paused. Acceptance had steadied me, but it had not yet given me direction. I had stopped drowning, but I was still standing in deep water. Rebuilding, I learned, is not about becoming who you were before the loss. That version of me no longer existed. It is about becoming someone new without denying who you've been. This realization changed everything. For a long time, I thought rebuilding meant replacing what I lost, finding something to fill the space my son had left behind. But nothing replaces a child, and trying to do so only deepened the emptiness. So I stopped trying to fill the space. Instead, I focused on strengthening the parts of myself that were still intact. I started by rebuilding trust with my own life, trust that my days could still hold meaning, trust that my future was not canceled, trust that joy was not disloyal. This was harder than it sounds. There was a part of me that believed happiness would somehow erase my son, that if I smiled too easily, I was abandoning him emotionally. I had to confront that belief. I learned that joy does not erase love. It does not diminish grief. It simply proves that pain did not take everything. Rebuilding also required structure. Loss had dissolved my routines. Days blurred together, time lost its shape, so I gave my days form again. Simple things, regular walks, consistent meals, sleeping and waking with intention. These were not dramatic changes, but they anchored me. Structure gave my emotions a container. It kept me from drifting. I also began exploring purpose in a different way. Before, purpose had been external, centered on caregiving, responsibility, being needed. Now, I had to redefine it internally. I asked myself new questions. What brings me calm? What helps me feel present? What makes the hours pass without resistance? These questions felt strange at first, almost indulgent, but they mattered. I discovered that purpose does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. I found purpose in listening rather than fixing, in being present rather than productive, in learning rather than teaching. I also noticed how grief had sharpened my awareness of others. I became more attentive to unspoken pain, more patient with silence, more understanding of emotional complexity. These were strengths I had earned through loss. Rebuilding meant honoring those strengths rather than ignoring them. I stopped seeing myself as diminished. I began seeing myself as changed. That shift mattered. I also had to rebuild my relationship with hope. Hope had betrayed me before, or at least that's how it felt. I had hoped my son would return quickly. I had hoped time would heal everything. I had hoped love would be enough. When those hopes were not fulfilled, hope itself felt dangerous, so I learned to redefine it. Hope no longer meant expecting a specific outcome. It meant staying open to possibility. I hoped not for reunion, but for peace. Not for answers, but for clarity. Not for restoration, but for growth. This form of hope was quieter, less fragile. It didn't collapse when reality disappointed me. Rebuilding also involved reconnecting with the world. For a long time, I had withdrawn socially, not intentionally, but emotionally. I was present, but guarded. I began slowly letting people back in, not with my entire story, just with my presence. I learned that connection does not require explanation. I could be known without being fully understood. This was freeing. I stopped feeling obligated to justify my pain or explain my past. I allowed myself to exist without narrative. Rebuilding required patience. There were days when I felt strong, days when I felt fragile, days when grief resurfaced without warning. I stopped seeing these fluctuations as setbacks. They were part of the process. Growth is not linear. Healing does not move in a straight line. Some days rebuilding meant rest. Other days it meant engagement. Both mattered. I also learned how to set emotional priorities. I stopped investing energy in things that drained me. I stopped forcing conversations that felt unsafe. I stopped seeking validation from people who could not offer it. This wasn't bitterness, it was discernment. Loss had taught me how limited energy is. I began protecting it. Rebuilding also meant reclaiming agency. For years, My emotional state had been influenced by circumstances beyond my control. Waiting, hoping, reacting. I wanted my life back in my hands. So I began making choices deliberately, small choices, intentional ones, how I spent my mornings, what I allowed into my mind, what stories I told myself about my worth. These choices accumulated. They gave me a sense of authorship over my own life again. I was no longer just responding to loss. I was shaping something new. I also confronted the fear of forgetting. There was a quiet fear that if I moved forward, my son would fade from my inner life. But I learned that memory does not require suffering to stay alive. Love is not preserved by pain. I could remember him without breaking myself open. That realization was liberating. Rebuilding allowed my love to become softer, less desperate, more enduring. I carried him with me without letting his absence define me. This balance took time, but once it formed, it was steady. I realized that rebuilding is not about achieving happiness. It is about reclaiming agency, dignity, and presence. It is about standing fully in your life, even when parts of it remain unresolved. As I rebuilt, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum, not urgency, not ambition. Momentum, the sense that life was moving again, and I was moving with it. I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't need to. Rebuilding had given me enough strength to trust the process, and that strength prepared me for the next realization. That forgiveness, both toward myself and others, would become the final turning point in this long journey. For a long time, I misunderstood forgiveness. I thought it was something you offered to someone else, something generous, something moral. What I did not understand was that forgiveness is first a release you give yourself. I carried resentment quietly, not loudly, not dramatically. It lived in the background of my thoughts, in the questions that never left me, in the moments when I replayed conversations and imagined different endings. I told myself I wasn't angry, that I was past that stage. But resentment doesn't always feel like anger. Sometimes it feels like tension. Sometimes it feels like fatigue. Sometimes it feels like a tightness you don't notice until it loosens. I resented the silence. I resented the lack of explanation. I resented how easily my son seemed to disappear from my life while I remained stuck with the consequences. That resentment did not make me a bad parent. It made me human, but it weighed on me. It kept me emotionally tethered to the past. It kept my healing conditional. I believed that forgiveness required understanding, an apology, closure, and since none of those things were available to me, I told myself forgiveness wasn't possible. That belief kept me stuck. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a transaction. It does not depend on someone else's awareness or remorse. It depends on your willingness to stop carrying what is hurting you. This realization came slowly. I noticed how often my thoughts returned to blame, sometimes directed at my son, sometimes at myself, sometimes at circumstances I could not change. Blame gave me the illusion of control. If someone was at fault, then the pain made sense, but blame also kept the wound open. Every time I revisited it, I reopened the story. Every time I searched for fault, I delayed peace. Forgiveness began when I acknowledged how tired I was. Tired of carrying unanswered questions, tired of rehearsing pain, tired of being emotionally anchored to a moment I could not undo. I did not forgive suddenly. I forgave gradually, in layers. I started with forgiving myself. Forgiving myself for not knowing what I know now, for reacting with fear instead of understanding, for believing love alone would be enough to prevent distance. I forgave myself for the ways I had failed without intention. This was not easy. Self-forgiveness required honesty without cruelty. It required acknowledging mistakes without turning them into a verdict on my worth. I learned that regret is only useful when it leads to growth. When it becomes punishment, it loses its purpose. As I forgave myself, something shifted. The heaviness in my chest eased slightly. My thoughts became less sharp, less repetitive. Then I began approaching forgiveness toward my son. This was harder, because forgiving him felt like minimizing my pain, like saying what happened didn't matter. But forgiveness did not erase the impact of his absence. It simply acknowledged his humanity. I began to see him not as the person who hurt me, but as a person shaped by his own struggles, perceptions, and limitations. I did not excuse his choices. I did not justify the silence. I simply recognized that he was not acting with the intention to destroy me. That distinction mattered. Forgiveness did not require reconciliation. It did not require contact. It only required release. I stopped expecting him to fulfill a role he could not or would not take on at that time. I stopped holding him to the image I had of who he should be. This did not diminish my love, it matured it. Forgiveness allowed my love to exist without resentment. I also forgave the situation itself. The timing, the misunderstandings, the emotional gaps. I forgave the fact that life does not always unfold with clarity. This kind of forgiveness is quiet. It does not announce itself. You notice it in how your body relaxes, in how your thoughts slow down, in how the story loses its grip on your nervous system. Forgiveness gave me space to breathe, space to think, space to live without constantly revisiting the same pain. I also learned that forgiveness is not permanent. It is not a one-time decision. Some days resentment resurfaced, triggered by a memory, a reminder, a moment of vulnerability. When that happened, I did not judge myself. I returned to forgiveness again. Each time it became easier. Forgiveness did not change the past, but it changed how the past lived inside me. I no longer felt consumed by what I could not control. I felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because I was no longer feeding it. Forgiveness also reshaped my sense of power. I realized that holding onto resentment had given my pain authority over my life. Letting go reclaimed that authority. I was no longer waiting for an apology to move forward. I was no longer dependent on understanding to find peace. I chose peace anyway. This did not make me passive. It made me free. Forgiveness also deepened my compassion. Not just toward my son, but toward myself, toward others. I became more patient with emotional complexity, more accepting of imperfect communication, more aware of how easily love and fear become entangled. Loss had softened me. Forgiveness refined that softness into strength. I learned that forgiveness is not weakness, it is endurance. It is choosing not to let pain dictate your future. It is deciding that your life deserves space beyond grief. As forgiveness settled into me, I noticed another change. I stopped defining my story by what was missing. I began defining it by what I had survived. This shift was subtle, but profound. I was no longer a person waiting to be healed by reunion. I was a person who had learned how to live fully even in the absence of answers. Forgiveness did not close the door to my son. It simply allowed me to step away from it without bitterness. I remained open, but not consumed. I carried love without weight, and in that freedom I felt something unexpected. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance. Peace with what was. Peace with what might never be. Peace with myself. That peace did not make me forget. It made me whole, and it prepared me for the next stage, the moment when life would offer a shift, a change, a reconnection of a different kind, not a reunion yet, but a sign, a moment that would test everything I had learned. I had reached a place where I no longer waited for signs, not because I didn't care, but because I had learned how dangerous waiting could be. Waiting keeps you suspended. It keeps your life conditional. It ties your peace to something you cannot control, so I stopped waiting. I lived my days without scanning the horizon for change, without bracing myself for contact, without rehearsing conversations that might never happen. And that was when something subtle shifted, not an event, not a message, not a reunion, something internal. I noticed that the thought of my son no longer came with immediate pain. It came with warmth. This startled me. For years, thinking about him had triggered grief, longing, regret. Now, there was something else beneath it. Acceptance had softened the edges. Forgiveness had released the weight. What remained was love, without urgency. This change prepared me for what came next. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was a moment of awareness. I realized I was no longer afraid of hearing from him. That fear had lived quietly in me. The fear that contact would reopen wounds I had worked so hard to close. The fear that I would unravel if hope returned. But now I felt steady. I understood that whatever happened, I would survive it. This was a turning point, not because something happened externally, but because I had changed internally. Life has a way of sensing when you are no longer desperate, when you are no longer grasping. And while I don't believe in destiny in a dramatic sense, I do believe in readiness. I was ready, ready not for reunion, but for truth, whatever form it took. I noticed how my body responded differently to reminders. A familiar name, a shared memory, my chest no longer tightened, my breath no longer shortened. I stayed present. This was new. I also noticed how my expectations had changed. I no longer imagined apologies. I no longer imagined explanations. If contact came, I would meet it without demand. This was freedom. Then there were signs, not from him, from life. Conversations with strangers that touched something deep. Moments of reflection that mirrored my own journey. I realized how many people live with unresolved grief, how many carry loss without language. This awareness connected me to others in a new way. I felt less alone. I also began noticing how my story had meaning beyond my personal pain, not as a lesson, not as inspiration, but as truth. Truth about love without control, about endurance, about the human capacity to hold complexity. This realization gave me a quiet sense of purpose, not to share my story publicly, but to live it honestly. The turning point came one ordinary day. Nothing remarkable happened, but I felt something settle. A sense that my life was no longer paused, that whatever came next would not define me. I had learned how to stand fully in uncertainty, that skill changed everything. I also confronted the possibility that my son might never return, not as a fear, but as a reality, and I noticed something surprising. I did not collapse. I grieved the possibility, but it did not undo me. This told me how far I had come. I realized that healing does not guarantee reunion. It guarantees resilience. It ensures that no matter what happens, you remain intact. That understanding was powerful. I stopped seeing my journey as incomplete. I began seeing it as whole. This wholeness did not depend on resolution. It depended on integration. I had integrated the loss into my life story without letting it consume me. That is when light began to come through, not through the door I had been watching, but through places I hadn't noticed before. Friendships deepened, moments felt richer, time felt more present. I was no longer bracing myself, I was living, and then something else happened. I noticed that my compassion had expanded, not just toward my son, but toward myself. I stopped measuring my worth by outcomes. I accepted that love does not guarantee closeness. That truth no longer felt like a failure. It felt like maturity. This turning point did not bring answers. It brought peace, and peace created space. Space for possibility, for openness, for whatever might come. I no longer needed signs, but I was no longer closed to them either. I stood in a balanced place. Open without attachment, hopeful without expectation. That is where the light entered, not in the form of reunion, but in the form of readiness. Readiness to meet whatever life offered next. This readiness changed how I understood healing. Healing was not about fixing the past. It was about meeting the future without fear. I felt grounded, present, whole, and in that state, something unexpected became possible. Connection, not forced, not demanded, but allowed. And while I did not know it then, this readiness would soon be tested, because life has a way of asking whether we truly believe what we have learned, and the next chapter would bring that question into focus. When contact finally came, it did not arrive with drama. There was no warning, no build-up. It was quiet, almost ordinary, and that was what made it so powerful. For years, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. Shock, relief, overwhelming emotion, but when it happened, I felt something else first. Stillness. My body went calm before my mind caught up, as if every part of me paused to assess whether this was real. I read the words more than once, not because I didn't understand them, but because I needed to feel them settle. There it was, proof of life, proof of connection, and yet I did not rush. That surprised me. The version of myself from years earlier would have reacted immediately, with urgency, with emotion, with questions spilling out uncontrollably, but I was no longer that person. I had learned restraint, not as a defense, but as a form of self-respect. I noticed how many emotions surfaced at once. Relief, joy, fear, grief. They did not arrive separately. They arrived together, and I let them. I did not try to organize them. I did not try to suppress them. I simply allowed them to exist. That moment tested everything I had learned. I felt the pull to return to old patterns, to over-explain, to apologize excessively, to prove my love. But I resisted, not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough not to abandon myself. I took time before responding, not to punish, not to play games, but to ground myself. I asked myself what I wanted to say, not what I hoped he would think, not what might guarantee future contact. What was true, that question mattered. I realized that honesty without desperation was my anchor. So when I responded, I did so simply. Without expectation, without pressure. I did not demand explanations. I did not revisit the past. I met him where he was. That choice was intentional. I understood that contact did not mean repair. It did not mean resolution. It meant a doorway had opened, and doorways require care. As communication continued, I became aware of how fragile this moment was. Every word mattered. Every silence carried weight. I felt the urge to rush forward, to reclaim lost time. But I remembered something important. Connection built slowly lasts longer than connection built on urgency. I paid attention to my body. When tension rose, I paused. When fear surfaced, I breathed. I refused to let excitement override wisdom. This was not about winning someone back. It was about building something that could stand. I also noticed how different this contact felt from my imagination. It was not emotionally intense in the way I had once expected. It was measured, cautious, and that was okay. We were two changed people meeting again. Time had passed. Lives had unfolded. I did not assume closeness. I allowed space. This was an act of trust. Trust that connection does not need to be forced to be real. There were moments when old pain resurfaced, small reminders of absence, unanswered questions, but I did not let those moments hijack the present. I had learned that the present deserves protection. I focused on listening. Not to respond, but to understand. I listened for tone, for intention, for vulnerability, and I noticed something important. He was careful too. This was not one-sided. We were both navigating unfamiliar territory. That realization softened me. It reminded me that estrangement changes everyone involved. No one returns unchanged. I did not ask why he had left, not yet. I understood that timing matters. Some truths need safety before they can be spoken. I prioritized safety, emotional safety for both of us. I also paid attention to my own boundaries. I did not sacrifice my stability for proximity. I did not ignore my needs to maintain contact. I stayed grounded. This was new. I was no longer willing to disappear to keep someone else comfortable, and yet I was gentle. Balance mattered. As contact continued, I noticed something profound. I was no longer afraid of losing him again. That fear had once controlled me, but now I trusted myself. I trusted that even if contact ended, I would survive it. This trust changed how I showed up. I was present, not anxious, open, not desperate. That energy shaped everything. I did not cling. I allowed connection to unfold naturally. Some days communication was brief, other days more open. I accepted both. I let go of expectations. This was not a reunion story. It was a reconnection story, and reconnection requires patience. I also noticed how this contact affected my inner world. I did not feel complete. I did not feel fixed, but I felt integrated. This was not about reclaiming something lost. It was about acknowledging something ongoing. Love does not expire, it changes form. This contact did not erase the years of absence, but it reframed them. They became part of our shared history rather than a wall between us. That mattered. I also learned that healing prepares you for connection, not the other way around. If this contact had come earlier, it would have destroyed me. I would have been consumed by fear and expectation. But now I was ready to engage without losing myself, ready to love without controlling, ready to hold hope lightly. That readiness was everything. I did not know where this connection would lead. And for the first time, I did not need to know. I trusted the process. I trusted myself, and I trusted that whatever happened next, I would remain whole. This moment did not end the journey, but it marked a turning point. From healing in isolation to healing in relationship, from survival to presence, from fear to trust, and that set the stage for the final realization that even if nothing more happened, I had already learned the most important lesson. Losing my son for 5 years did not teach me one single lesson. It taught me many, slowly, painfully, honestly, and the most important thing it taught me is this: love is not something you own, it is something you practice. Before this journey, I believed love was proven through presence, through effort, through sacrifice. I believed that if I showed up enough, cared enough, gave enough, love would be secure. But I learned that love is not secured by control. It is secured by truth, and sometimes the truth is that love exists even when connection does not. That understanding changed how I see everything. I spent years believing that if someone leaves, it means the love was not strong enough. That belief nearly broke me, because I loved my son with everything I had, and yet he still left. What I know now is that people do not leave because love is absent. They leave because pain, fear, misunderstanding, or unmet needs overwhelm their ability to stay. Love alone does not fix that. That realization freed me from a burden I had carried silently. I stopped measuring my worth by outcomes I could not control. I stopped asking whether I had been enough. I understood that being enough does not guarantee being chosen, and that truth, as painful as it is also liberating. Losing my son taught me that grief is not a single emotion, it is a landscape. There were days of sadness, days of anger, days of numbness, days of quiet acceptance, and sometimes all of them in the same hour. Grief did not follow rules. It did not move in a straight line. It revisited me in waves. But over time, the waves changed. They still came, but they no longer knocked me down. I learned how to stand in them. Grief also taught me that time does not heal on its own. What heals is how you live inside time. Ignoring pain does not make it disappear. Rushing healing does not make it faster. What heals is presence, honesty, compassion toward yourself. I learned to stop asking when I would be healed. I started asking how I could live fully even while carrying grief. That shift changed everything. Losing my son also taught me about identity. I had believed my purpose was fixed, defined by roles: parent, caregiver, provider. When that role was disrupted, I felt erased. But identity is not static. It evolves. I learned that I am not only who I am to others, I am who I am to myself. That lesson was difficult. It required me to face parts of myself I had neglected, desires I had postponed, needs I had minimized, but it also gave me freedom. I discovered that purpose can be internal, quiet, personal. It does not need recognition to be real. Losing my son also taught me about loneliness. Loneliness is not simply the absence of people, it is the absence of understanding. For a long time, I felt unseen. My grief did not fit into easy conversations. It made people uncomfortable, so I learned to hold it alone. That isolation was painful, but it also forced me to build a relationship with myself. I learned how to sit with my thoughts, how to feel without escaping, how to listen to my inner voice. Loneliness taught me self-trust. It taught me that I could survive silence without losing myself. It also taught me empathy. I became more sensitive to the quiet pain in others, the stories people don't tell, the losses they carry privately. Loss opened my heart in ways comfort never could. Forgiveness was another lesson I did not expect. I believed forgiveness required resolution. But forgiveness, I learned, is not about making sense of what happened. It is about choosing not to let the past dictate the future. Forgiving my son did not mean excusing his absence. Forgiving myself did not mean denying my mistakes. It meant releasing the belief that pain must be punished. Forgiveness gave me back my energy. It returned my focus to the present. It allowed me to live without bitterness, and that was a gift I gave myself. Rebuilding my life taught me patience. I wanted progress to be visible, measurable, but healing works quietly. It shows up in how you respond to triggers, in how you speak to yourself, in how you rest without guilt. Rebuilding was not dramatic. It was steady, and that steadiness became my strength. I learned that happiness is not a permanent state, it is a momentary experience. Peace, however, is something you can cultivate. Peace comes from alignment, from living truthfully, from respecting your limits. I learned to stop chasing happiness and start choosing peace. That choice changed how I approached everything. When contact with my son returned, it tested every lesson I had learned. Old fears resurfaced. Old hopes stirred, but I did not lose myself. That was the greatest proof of growth. I realized that healing is not about preventing pain. It is about trusting yourself to handle it. I no longer needed guarantees. I trusted my resilience. That trust allowed me to engage without desperation, to love without control, to be present without fear. And even now, I do not know what the future holds. Reconnection does not promise permanence. But I am no longer afraid of that uncertainty, because I have learned something essential. I can love deeply and still remain whole. I can lose and still live fully. I can hope without attaching my survival to the outcome. That knowledge is my foundation now. If I could speak to the version of myself at the beginning of this journey, I would not offer reassurance. I would offer permission. Permission to grieve without shame. Permission to rest. Permission to let go of explanations. Permission to redefine love. I would tell myself that strength does not look like endurance alone. It looks like softness that survives. I would say this: you will not be the same after this, but you will be deeper, wiser, more compassionate. You will learn that love does not disappear when someone leaves. It transforms, and transformation, while painful, is not loss. It is evolution. Losing my son for 5 years changed me, but it did not destroy me. It taught me how to live without guarantees, how to love without possession, how to find meaning without certainty. And that, in the end, may be the most honest way to live. This story does not end with closure. It ends with understanding that love is not proven by closeness alone, that healing is not dependent on reunion. That wholeness is something you build, not something someone gives back to you. I still carry my son in my heart, not as an ache, but as a presence, and I carry myself with more care than ever before. That is what I learned, that is how I healed, and that is how I continue to live.